A poor cleaner is fired for pretending to break a crystal goblet in the mansion that the millionaire's son had broken. But a millionaire discovered the reason and did something that shocked everyone. Comment and give a score from 0 to 10. For my story, your opinion is very important, and subscribe to my channel to support my work. I count on your help. The sound of crystal shattering against the cold marble echoed through the mansion like a gunshot in the afternoon silence. The cleaning lady, her hands calloused and her uniform faded, felt her heart leap into her chest as she watched the shards of the antique goblet scattered across the floor of the grand hall. The 4-year-old boy, with his tousled blonde hair and wide, terrified blue eyes, stood frozen before the destruction he had just caused. Tears welled up in the child's eyes as he grasped the gravity of what had happened. The goblet wasn't just any decorative object. It was a family heirloom that had been passed down through generations, witnessing decades of history and accumulated wealth. Its sentimental value far exceeded any amount of money that could be offered as a replacement. The woman of humble origins, who had worked in that imposing house in the heart of the bustling metropolis of New York City for 2 years, knew exactly what that destruction meant. She knew the explosive temper of her boss, a 30-year-old businessman whose fortune had been built through aggressive investments on Wall Street and whose net worth in dollars seemed to grow every day. His strictness and perfectionism were legendary among the staff, who walked on eggshells to avoid provoking his wrath. The boy began to sob softly, his small hands trembling as he tried to pick up the larger pieces of crystal. His words came out in gasps between sobs. He begged that no one tell his father, promised he would be more careful, swore he would never run through the house again. The despair in the child's voice deeply touched the cleaning lady's heart, who saw in that moment not the spoiled son of a multimillionaire, but just a terrified child. Without hesitating for even a second, she knelt beside the boy and began to gather the fragments of crystal with her own hands. She whispered soothing words, saying that everything would be all right, that she would take care of everything. The relief in the child's eyes was instant, but she knew she was sealing her own fate at that moment. When firm, authoritative footsteps echoed through the marble hallway, announcing the arrival of the owner of the mansion, the courageous woman had already assumed a position that made clear her supposed responsibility for the accident. The boy was quickly sent to his room, away from the penetrating eyes of his father, who now surveyed the scene with a somber expression. The ruthless millionaire observed the wreckage of the family heirloom with a coldness that made the cleaning lady's blood run cold. His dark eyes, which had intimidated adversaries in boardrooms and closed deals worth millions, now fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to pierce her soul. The man's masculine good looks, with his aristocratic features and imposing stature, only intensified the aura of power and authority that emanated from his every gesture. The humiliation that followed was devastating. Accusations of negligence and carelessness rained down on the bowed head of the woman, who accepted each word in silence, protecting with her sacrifice the innocence of the boy who played carefree in his room. The dismissal came accompanied by veiled threats of lawsuits and the certainty that that stain on her professional record would follow her forever. As she gathered her few belongings from the maid's quarters, the cleaning lady thought of her 4-year-old daughter who awaited her in the precarious shack on the outskirts of town. The girl, who appeared to be only 2 years old due to constant malnutrition, depended completely on the salary she had now lost. The money she managed to save from her work barely covered the cost of the powdered milk needed to keep the child fed. The farewell was witnessed by all the other employees, who lowered their eyes with shame and relief that they were not in her place. None dared to defend their co-worker, fearing for their own stability in such difficult times. The loneliness of that moment weighed like lead on the shoulders of the woman who walked for the last time through the corridors she had cleaned with such care. From the top of the grand staircase, the businessman watched the scene with a satisfaction that would soon turn into something much more complex and disturbing. Something in that woman's silent dignity, in the way she held her head high even in the face of injustice, sparked an uncomfortable curiosity that he tried to ignore. Why hadn't she defended herself? Why had she so passively accepted an accusation that could have been challenged? The large, solid wood door closed behind the fired cleaning lady, sealing not only the end of her employment, but the beginning of a journey of suffering that would test all the limits of her resistance. The sound of that door echoed in her mind like the drumming of drums, announcing a battle that she would have to fight alone, armed only with her dignity and maternal love. 3 months had passed since that fateful day, and the courageous woman's life had turned into a daily nightmare of struggle for survival. She woke up before dawn to prepare homemade sweets that she sold in the dusty streets of the city, facing the scorching sun and the freezing rain with equal determination. Her hands, previously calloused only by housework, now bled due to the long hours stirring hot syrups and carrying heavy baskets. Her small daughter had become even thinner, and the nights were filled with the sound of her persistent cough that echoed through the thin walls of the shack. The money barely covered the cost of basic medicines, let alone a proper medical consultation. The guilt of not being able to offer a better life for the child consumed the broken heart of the mother, who arrived home exhausted only to find more overdue bills and the refrigerator almost empty. The former acquaintances from the neighborhood whispered on the corners about her shameful dismissal, inventing increasingly fanciful versions of what had really happened in that mansion. The gossip spread like wildfire, turning her reputation into rubble and making it even more difficult to find any other work. Shame weighed on her shoulders like an invisible burden that grew with each judgmental look she received. The ruthless businessman never imagined that a routine visit to his son's private school would completely change the course of his life. On that sunny morning, he had decided to attend the meeting with the teachers personally, something he rarely did due to his busy schedule of financial commitments and decisions that moved millions in investments. His investments in stock market shares demanded constant attention, and every minute away from the offices represented a potential loss of profit. As he waited in the schoolyard, watching the children play during recess, his thoughts wandered between the numbers of his asset portfolio and the strategies to further diversify his wealth. He had just closed an important deal involving international funds, and part of his fortune was now being applied to cryptocurrencies, following the trend of the major investors of the time. It was then that he heard the familiar voice of his son talking animatedly with a group of classmates near the playground. The boy, who had completely recovered from the trauma of that terrible day, was telling with childish pride about how he had broken a very important goblet at home. The words that followed made the millionaire's blood run cold. The child described in detail how he was running through the house when he bumped into the table where the family's antique goblet was kept. He spoke about how he was very afraid of what his father would do, but that the kind cleaning lady had taken the blame to protect him. The other boys listened fascinated as he explained that the woman knew she would be fired, but even so, she decided to save him from a punishment she knew all too well. The businessman felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. Each word of his son was like a dagger in his conscience, revealing a truth that completely shattered the version of events he had built in his mind. The humble cleaning lady had not been negligent or careless. She had been heroic, sacrificing her own livelihood to protect an innocent child. The memories of that day returned with brutal clarity. The woman's resigned posture, the way she accepted all the accusations without defending herself, the serene look even in the face of public humiliation. Everything made sense now, and the guilt that began to grow in his chest was suffocating. He had destroyed the life of an honest person because of his blind arrogance and hasty judgments. During the days that followed, the business magnate found that he could not concentrate on anything. The board meetings seemed endless, the financial reports became incomprehensible, and even the fluctuations of the stock market lost the fascination they had always exerted on him. His mind was consumed by a single obsession: to find the wronged cleaning lady and try to repair the terrible evil he had caused. The search began discreetly. He used his contacts and resources to find out where she lived, but the information was scarce. He knew only that she lived on the outskirts of the great metropolis, in a region he had never visited in his 30 years of privileged life. His investments in gold and various applications had ensured that he never needed to leave the golden bubble that surrounded his existence. It was during a rainy Friday that he finally found her. She was at a local market, in the middle of a crowd of workers who were buying groceries after a long day of toil. She was selling homemade sweets at an improvised stall, her calloused hands handling the products carefully, offering kind smiles to customers even with the tiredness etched on her face, marked by the constant struggle. The shock of recognition was mutual. When their eyes met over the crowd, time seemed to stop. She was thinner, with worry lines that had not existed before, but she still maintained that dignity that no adversity had managed to break. In the woman's tired eyes, he saw a depth that his wealth had never been able to buy. The approach was hesitant. The powerful businessman, accustomed to commanding boardrooms and intimidating adversaries, felt small before that simple woman who sold sweets to survive. His expensive clothes and luxury watch seemed ridiculous in that environment, further marking the distance between the two worlds they represented. The plea for forgiveness that came from his lips was sincere and emotional, like nothing he had ever expressed. He confessed to having discovered the truth about that terrible day, assumed full responsibility for his negligence and prejudice, and begged for a chance to repair all the damage his arrogance had caused. The tears that rolled down his face were real, born of a guilt that was corroding his soul. Her reaction was the same serenity she had shown on the day of the unfair dismissal. She listened in silence, without interrupting him, allowing him to empty his heart of all the accumulated guilt. When he finished, she just nodded slightly, as if she already knew that this moment would eventually come. She showed no anger or resentment, but she also did not offer the immediate forgiveness he so sought. The offer he made went far beyond the simple restitution of the job. He proposed a position of trust in his company, a position that recognized her exceptional character and moral integrity. He spoke about decent salary, health insurance for her and her daughter, private education for the girl, and all the reparations that his money could buy. But he perceived in her eyes that those material offers were not what really mattered. She asked for time to think. She explained that she needed to consider not only her own situation, but mainly the well-being of her daughter, who had already suffered so much from the abrupt changes in their lives. The distrust in relation to his intentions was understandable. Why would a man of such wealth genuinely care about the fate of a cleaning lady? The week that followed was agonizing for the repentant businessman. He discovered that all his assets, all his investments and applications meant absolutely nothing if he could not sleep in peace, knowing that he had repaired the injustice committed. For the first time in his adult life, money seemed completely irrelevant in the face of a question that touched his humanity. It was on a grey Monday that she appeared in his luxurious office, located on the top floor of a skyscraper that dominated the horizon of the metropolis. She wore her best clothes, which still seemed humble before the opulence that surrounded her. She said she had decided to accept the offer, not for greed or material interest, but because she needed to believe that people can change and that her daughter deserved a better chance in life. The first day of work in the new role was tense for both. She now occupied her own office, with a view of the city she had always observed only from the streets. Her responsibilities involved supervising the cleaning and maintenance of all the company's commercial buildings, a position that required total trust from the boss. The other employees watched her with barely disguised curiosity, whispering about the mysterious woman who had won the trust of the notoriously demanding boss. The forced proximity of professional projects began to reveal unexpected aspects of both personalities. He discovered that behind the apparent simplicity, there was a practical intelligence and a natural wisdom that no formal education could teach. She, in turn, began to perceive the vulnerabilities of the seemingly invincible man, noticing how he struggled against authoritarian patterns that he had inherited from an emotionally arid childhood. The following months brought a subtle but profound transformation in the dynamics between the powerful businessman and the resilient woman. What had begun as a desperate attempt at amends was developing into something much more complex and dangerous. During work meetings, their eyes met for fractions of a second longer than was appropriate, creating a silent tension that they both tried to ignore. The cleaning lady's daughter had completely transformed with proper medical care and the regular meals that the new salary provided. The 4-year-old girl, who had previously appeared to be only 2 due to malnutrition, now played with energy and smiled constantly. She attended a private daycare center where she received a quality education, and her mother could finally sleep peacefully, knowing that the child was safe and well cared for. This radical change in her daughter's life awakened in the woman a deep gratitude that gradually began to mingle with more dangerous feelings. She observed how the man genuinely cared about the well-being of both of them, asking about the girl's health, ensuring that they had everything they needed, demonstrating a care that went far beyond professional obligation. During a particularly complex project involving the renovation of one of the company's commercial buildings, they spent long hours working side by side. It was on these occasions that the businessman began to open up about aspects of his life that he had never shared with anyone. He spoke about his lonely childhood in expensive boarding schools, about parents who showed love through extravagant gifts, but were never present for conversations or hugs. He revealed how he had built his fortune not only through a talent for business, but also through a compulsive need to prove his worth through growing numbers in bank accounts. His investments in stocks and bonds were a way to control a world that had always seemed chaotic and unpredictable. Each million added to his net worth represented another layer of protection against the vulnerability he so feared. The woman listened to these confessions with a compassion that completely disarmed him. She never judged or criticized, only offered a different perspective based on her life experience in the simplest layers of society. Her words had a healing power that no expensive therapy had managed to provide, touching emotional wounds that he didn't even know existed. The emotional connection that blossomed between them during an entire year of daily cohabitation did not go unnoticed by the other employees of the company. Whispers began to circulate through the hallways, speculations about the nature of the relationship between the millionaire boss and the former cleaning lady who now held a position of trust. The resistance was subtle but constant, manifesting itself in icy stares and seemingly innocent comments that carried poison. The situation became even more complicated when his family found out about the growing closeness between the two. The aristocratic mother, an icy woman who managed her own fortune through investment funds and gold holdings, made a point of making her disapproval clear. She organized dinners where she presented young women from high society as possible candidates for daughter-in-law, women who understood the world of business and could contribute to further expanding the family empire. Social pressure intensified when the relationship between them began to transpire more evidently. It was no longer possible to deny the mutual attraction that grew with each passing day. The way he looked for excuses to be near her, how she dressed more carefully when she knew he would be in the office, The sexual tension that had gradually developed now hung in the air like electricity before a thunderstorm. The first moment of physical intimacy happened during a work night that extended beyond normal hours. They were reviewing important contracts when a storm began to lash the city, and she missed the last subway home. He insisted that she stay and offered her a ride, but the flooded streets made it impossible to get to the outskirts of town where she lived. Alone in the silent office, with only the soft light of the lamps creating an intimate atmosphere, the professional barrier they maintained during the day began to dissolve. They talked about dreams, fears, regrets, sharing vulnerabilities that they had never exposed to other people. When he gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, the touch awakened an electric current that neither of them could ignore. The kiss that followed was inevitable, charged with months of accumulated tension and repressed feelings. It was not a moment of unbridled passion, but of deep connection, as if two souls that had been lost finally found their place in the world. When they separated, both knew that they had crossed a line that would change everything between them forever. The next morning brought the stark reality back. The social difference between them had never seemed as glaring as it did at that moment, when he wore suits that cost more than she earned in months, while she straightened her simple clothes, trying to maintain her dignity. Guilt and confusion took over both of them, creating an artificial distance that hurt more than the dangerous closeness. The most shocking discovery came through a casual conversation with the family lawyer, an elderly man who knew all the secrets of the business clan. During a review of old documents, he casually mentioned the story of the founding matriarch of the dynasty, the grandmother who had passed away when the businessman was still a child. To his absolute surprise, he discovered that she had been a humble housemaid before marrying the patriarch who built the empire. The revelation struck like a lightning bolt. All the class arrogance, all the prejudice that his family demonstrated against relationships with people of simple origins was based on monumental hypocrisy. The true roots of the family fortune were planted in the same humble soil from which came the woman who now occupied his thoughts day and night. Armed with this revolutionary discovery, he confronted his mother during a tense dinner, where she once again tried to push a suitable heiress in his direction. The explosion that followed revealed decades of guarded resentments, inconvenient truths that the family had buried under layers of privilege and accumulated wealth. The icy matriarch completely lost her composure when he threatened to make public the true origin of the family fortune. In parallel, the woman who had conquered his heart faced her own internal battles. Her small daughter had asked an innocent question about why some people lived in big houses while others lived in small shacks. How to explain to a 4-year-old child the complexities of a world divided by social differences that seemed insurmountable? The neighbors from the outskirts of town also did not make the situation easier. Some demonstrated poorly disguised envy for the sudden change in her life, whispering that there must certainly be something suspicious about such a radical promotion. Others offered unsolicited advice about the dangers of getting involved with rich men, warning that she would only be a temporary pastime before he returned to his world of privilege. The tension reached the boiling point when a gossip magazine managed to photograph the two leaving the office together on a rainy night. The image, although showing only an apparently innocent moment, was accompanied by malicious speculations about the relationship between the billionaire tycoon and his employee. The scandal spread quickly through the social circles of the elite, creating unbearable pressure on both. The crisis exploded when her daughter suddenly fell ill with a high fever that did not respond to basic medications. It was a Friday morning when she called him, desperate, asking for help to get emergency medical care. Without hesitating for a second, he abandoned an important meeting with international investors to rush to the hospital, unequivocally demonstrating where his true priorities lay. The most reputable private hospital in the metropolis had never received such an urgent and desperate visit as that Friday morning. The businessman arrived like a hurricane through the sterile corridors, carrying in his arms the 4-year-old daughter of the woman who had transformed his life, while she ran beside him with tears of despair streaming down her face. The girl's fever had reached dangerous levels, and every second seemed like an eternity. The medical team was mobilized immediately, not only because of the severity of the case, but because of the presence of the man whose fortune had financed an entire wing of that hospital. While the doctors examined the child, he remained beside the desperate mother, holding her trembling hand and whispering words of comfort that he never imagined would come out of his lips. At that moment, all his assets in stocks and investments meant absolutely nothing compared to the well-being of that family that had become the center of his universe. The hours dragged on like centuries while they awaited the test results. It was during this agonizing vigil that he realized with crystal clarity how much his life had changed. The man who a year earlier was capable of firing employees without blinking was now praying fervently for the recovery of a child who was not even his biological daughter, but who had won a permanent place in his heart. When finally the doctors brought good news, it was an infection that would respond well to antibiotics. The relief was so intense that both burst into tears. It was in this moment of absolute vulnerability that the last barriers between them completely dissolved. She surrendered to his arms as if it were the safe haven she had sought all her life, and he held her as if she were the most precious treasure of all his fortune. The transformation that this night provoked in them was irreversible. She finally understood that his feelings were genuine, that it was not about the whim or curiosity of a bored, rich man. She saw how he had abandoned everything he considered important to be by their side at the most critical moment, demonstrating a love that transcended any social difference or family expectation. He, in turn, discovered that he had found not only a woman to love, but a complete family to protect and care for. The girl, still weak but already smiling, stretched her little arms out to him, asking to be held. And in that simple gesture, he found the purpose that all his businesses and financial applications had never managed to provide. For the first time in his adult life, he felt truly needed and loved for who he really was, not for the money he possessed. The decision to publicly assume the relationship was made that morning in the hospital. The malicious comments of society, the veiled threats of the family, or the risks to his business reputation no longer mattered. What he had discovered with that courageous woman and her adorable daughter was worth much more than all the social approval that his wealth could buy. The reaction of the wealthy elite was explosive when the news spread through the social circles of the metropolis. Former business partners cancelled contracts, traditional families withdrew their investments from his funds, and the aristocratic mother threatened to disinherit the son who had dared to tarnish the family name with such an inappropriate romance. But to his surprise, he discovered that these attacks only strengthened his determination. The employees of the company watched in astonishment the transformation of their boss. The rigid and authoritarian man who commanded meetings with an iron fist had become more human, more accessible, demonstrating a genuine concern for the well-being of all employees. He implemented benefit policies that included health plans extended to families, daycare centers for employees' children, and continuing education programs that would allow for real professional growth. The woman who had conquered his love also needed to face drastic changes in her life. The move from the outskirts of town to an elegant apartment in the city center was only the most visible aspect of a much deeper transformation. She had to learn to navigate social events where she was observed with curiosity and often with hostility, barely disguised by the other women of high society. But her inner strength, forged in the years of struggle for survival, proved more powerful than any social prejudice. She remained dignified and serene in the face of malicious comments, responding with natural elegance to subtle provocations, gradually winning the respect even of those who initially despised her. Her authenticity contrasted sharply with the artificiality that dominated that social environment. Her daughter blossomed in the new environment like a flower that finally received adequate water and sunlight. She now attended a private school of excellence, where her natural intelligence found space to fully develop. The most touching thing was to observe how she had spontaneously adopted the businessman as a father figure, affectionately calling him Godfather and running into his arms whenever he arrived home. The decisive moment came when the icy matriarch of the family attempted one last desperate coup to separate the couple. Using her contacts in the press, she tried to create a scandal involving alleged irregularities in the hiring of the former cleaning lady, suggesting that there was something illicit in the professional relationship that preceded the romance. But the strategy backfired when old documents brought to light the true story of the founding of the family fortune. The public revelation that the founding matriarch of the dynasty herself had been a humble housemaid caused an earthquake in the social circles of the elite. Investigative journalists unearthed historical records that showed how the original patriarch had fallen madly in love with a simple woman, facing the same family resistance that was now repeating itself a generation later. The hypocrisy of the opposition to the current romance became glaringly evident. The social pressure that was previously contrary to the relationship began to reverse. The love story that faced class obstacles won the sympathy of the public, who saw in the couple a modern version of the great romances that defy social conventions. Magazines that previously published malicious gossip began to portray the relationship as an example that true love transcends social differences. The company prospered unexpectedly under the new, humanized philosophy of the transformed businessman. Motivated and well-treated employees produced exceptional results. Important contracts were renewed by partners who admired the demonstrated integrity, and new investors appeared attracted by a management that combined business efficiency with social responsibility. His assets continued to grow, but now the money had a much nobler purpose. The marriage proposal happened in a simple and moving way, far from the spotlight and social pressure. During a picnic in Central Park, where they used to take the girl to play, he knelt before the woman who had completely transformed his life and asked them to become an official family. The ring wasn't the most expensive that his net worth could buy, but it was chosen with love and care, symbolizing a commitment that was worth more than any financial investment. The wedding ceremony was a unique event that brought together people from all walks of life. Company employees shared tables with influential business people. Neighbors from the old outskirts of town chatted animatedly with members of high society, and the atmosphere was one of genuine celebration of a love that had overcome all obstacles. The radiant bride wore a simple but elegant dress, and her natural beauty surpassed any luxurious adornment. The groom's speech during the party moved all those present. He spoke about how he had discovered that true wealth is not measured in dollars or investments, but in the ability to love and be loved unconditionally. He thanked his wife for saving not only his son from that terrible day, but for saving himself from an empty life dedicated only to the accumulation of wealth without real purpose. The honeymoon was spent not in exotic destinations that his fortune could afford, but in a simple beach house where they could simply be a normal family, away from the pressures and expectations that surrounded their public lives. The girl played on the sand while the couple walked hand in hand, planning a future where love would always be more important than any bank account. Years later, when they told their story to their now grown daughter, they both agreed that that broken crystal goblet had been the most valuable gift that life could give them. The accident that seemed like a tragedy had revealed itself to be the beginning of a journey that led them to true love, proving that sometimes the greatest treasures arise from the most unlikely moments, and that the courage to protect the innocent can transform destinies in an extraordinary way.